regardless of your exposure to Christianity or to church, you've probably noticed that we talk a lot about Genesis. Genesis comes up in conversations among people in church. It comes up among conversations in scholarship. It's a biblical book that's probably the most likely to be talked about in college classrooms or high school classrooms, and probably the book that's most likely to be talked about even among politicians. You might ask, well, why is it that people are so concerned about Genesis? I would give 3 reasons that people are concerned about Genesis, and I want to especially connect with why Christians are concerned about Genesis and ought to be concerned about Genesis. First of all, and most obviously, Genesis is foundational to the biblical story. That's really easy to see. It's the first book of the Bible, and it makes sense that whatever other stories flow out of the Bible are in some sense a continuation of what happens in the book of Genesis. We see this within the Bible itself, that is pretty often that other biblical books are going to reference things that happened in Genesis. And we see that in both New Testament and Old Testament books that will sometimes reference back to themes or even sometimes explicit passages in the book of Genesis. So why would you care about what Genesis says? Well, if you believe that the Bible is valuable in any sense, you're going to care about Genesis because it helps set a foundation for the biblical story. Now let's jump and let's understand some explicit Christian convictions about Genesis. I think it's important to understand these for those of us who are Christians especially, because we really ought to be aware of why we're so concerned about Genesis. Why do we talk about Genesis so much? I also think it's something that I would like for non-Christians to have a greater awareness of. So if you know non-Christians, or if you see this video and you aren't a Christian and you say, well, why do Christians talk about Genesis so much? Why would they actually care so much about what this ancient book says? It's because if you're a Christian who believes that God is revealing truth through the Bible, then you see Genesis as foundational to the biblical story, but not just in the sense that it's foundational to a work of literature. It becomes foundational to worldview. Because as Christians, we believe that the Bible dictates God's will for us, how we are to understand God and understand the world around us and understand one another. And so this means that this worldview, it applies to at least 2 levels. One is we as Christians would see Genesis is foundational to history. When I say Genesis is foundation to history, what I mean is that we don't just see Genesis as the beginning of a story, but the beginning of the story, meaning that the things that were told in Genesis, that this is how God created the world to be, we as Christians would see as being normative. God created the world to be a place where He fellowshiped with His creatures. God created the world in such a way that His image bearers, humanity, were to look over creation, to guard it and to keep it, to have stewardship over creation. And we see that as setting this normative aspect of these are things to which we should aspire as God's people and as God's image bearers, that we are to aspire with fellowship with God, to live in community with one another and to see value in one another as image bearers, that we would see a vocation, that we're to work for the wise rulership of creation, and so that we can be fruitful and multiply. We're to work for the goodness of our fellow image bearers, and all of this done within community with God. We would see that as not just something that's a story from long ago or even something that just Christians are supposed to do, but we would understand that as being foundational to what it means to be human, because that's how Genesis lays out. That means that if Genesis is foundational to the story, to history, and it informs our worldview in that way, it of course also informs our ethics. This, I think, is a major worldview distinction between Christians and non-Christians, and Christians who see the Bible as God's Word versus Christians who see the Bible as an ancient document that might have some good ideas, but don't see the Bible as foundational to what it means to live a life as a Christian. For those of us who see the Bible as God's Word, who side and who affirm the historic Christian belief that the Bible is God's Word to us, that it's God speaking to us, and not just a book that gives us some things about God but can be dismissed in certain places, we're going to see what God says is good in Genesis as being good for us today. And so again, that gets into some things like sexuality. Christians don't believe, or at least ought not to believe, that marriage is between one man and one woman just because that's what they were taught in a certain cultural situation, but instead see marriage as being between one man and one woman because that's God's creative intent in humanity and his creative intent for humanity and for creation. In other words, this is how God created marriage to be, and that becomes normative for us as people. And this is the reason that Christians would look to Genesis and say, because God created things this way, this is actually what is good for us, and anything outside of this is a corruption of what God intended. And so that's how Genesis would function ethically on an issue like this. And of course, it applies to a great many other issues. Environmentalism is an issue that Genesis informs. We as Christians can be tempted to just be dismissive of things like our environment. But in Genesis, we're told that there's a vocation of humanity to work and to guard creation, or to work and keep creation. And this idea that we're to rule over creation. And what we see in the Bible is when you're called to rule over something, that's not just to have authoritarian dominion over it, but instead it's to rule over it with purpose and to be wise rulers. So we would see environmental ethics informed by this, that God doesn't want us to just be dismissive of our world, but instead to care for our world. And so Genesis not only gives us the foundation to the biblical story, but a foundation to worldview, both in history and in ethics. The last thing, and this is where we really see Genesis informing what it means to be a Christian, is that Genesis gives us our foundational theological worldview. I tell folks whenever I'm walking through Genesis that Genesis gives us the major characters and setting and plot of the biblical story. Not only the biblical story, but the story of all of history. We have in the book of Genesis the setting of our story. The cosmos are created, and so now we have this on the grandest scale, the setting and the space in which the story of all history takes place. We have the central characters in the story. We are living out a story that is a story about a God who desires to be in fellowship with the creatures that he has made. So it is, in a very real sense, a story about God and humanity. And we have the central conflict of this story, and that is that while God has created us with a good purpose, we have chosen, like our forefather and foremother, to seek goodness outside of what God has said is good, to buy into what Genesis makes very clear is the lie that the serpent tells, that God is holding out on us and he doesn't actually want what is best for us. But Genesis also tells us this. It tells us that while humanity has sinned, that God is pursuing humanity to reconcile this action. That humanity, what we see in Genesis, is humanity moves deeper and deeper into sinfulness. There's no way that we come out of reading the book of Genesis thinking, you know something, there's really a chance that humans get this right. Because what we see in Genesis in 1 through 11 is that humanity continues to get worse and worse to the point of the flood, and that even after the flood, Noah gets off the ark, gets drunk in a vineyard, and his family goes into chaos. We see the patriarchs rise up, and while we see glimpses of faithfulness in these women and men in these stories in Genesis 12 through 50, we also see tremendously flawed individuals. But through it all, we see a God who pursues humanity. And this lays a foundational theological expectation for us, that Genesis tells us that humanity sins and God pursues humanity to restore us to a covenant, and that it is going to be God and not humanity that ultimately is going to bring about reconciliation for this original purpose, that we would live in community with God. So why is Genesis so important? Because it gives us these three foundations. It's foundational to the biblical story, foundational to all of worldview, including history and ethics, and it is foundational to our theological understanding. And it's the reason that we as Christians would affirm that Genesis is pointing us towards the gospel. The ultimate manifestation of the expectations we see in Genesis are fulfilled whenever God becomes incarnate and dwells among us in Jesus Christ to restore us to the function and purpose of image bearers, to live in community with God and to be his representative rulers to creation. And we see in Revelation this great expectation that this is ultimately going to be fulfilled in the new heavens and the new earth, where the dwelling place of God is with man and we live in fellowship with him.